The legacy of Reverend King is long. As I grow older, I realize how long ago he lived. His words echo in my mind, but I wonder about those born today. What will his ideas mean to them? What will those ideas mean to our children who are just learning his big words and the big ideas? The world has changed since I was a child. We have a black president, but the striving for racial equality is not over. The words of King that most of us know are about racial equality. His "I have a dream" speech dominates our collective memory. But he said so much more. He spoke against war. He advocated labor rights. He spoke about the spiritual practice of nonviolence. We are standing on the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And 50 years ago, after President Kennedy was assassinated, Dr. King said these words: "Our late president was assassinated by a morally inclement climate. It is a climate filled with heavy torrents of false accusation, jostling winds of hatred, and raging storms of violence. It is a climate where men cannot disagree without being disagreeable, and where they express dissent through violence and murder. It is the same climate that murdered Medgar Evers in Mississippi and 6 innocent Negro children in Birmingham, Alabama. So in a sense, we are all participants in that horrible act that tarnished the image of our nation. By our silence, by our willingness to compromise principle, by our constant attempt to cure the cancer of racial injustice with the Vaseline of gradualism, by our readiness to allow arms to be purchased at will and fired at whim, by allowing our movie and television screens to teach our children that the hero is the one who masters the art of shooting and the technique of killing. By allowing all these developments, we have created an atmosphere in which violence and hatred have become popular pastimes." What he said 50 years ago could be said today in the wake of the Newtown shootings and the 900 gun deaths that have occurred in the past month across this nation. We want to think that we are in a season of progress, but the same struggles of the human condition continue century after century. Dr. King, in many of his speeches, drew back to the 19th century and quoted many Unitarians and brought their wisdom into the 20th century. King's often repeated expression that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, was his own succinct summation of sentiments of Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist and a Unitarian minister, who in his sermon of Justice and the Conscience in 1853 asserted, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." In King's book, Why I'm Against the Vietnam War, in 1967, he wrote, "I have not lost faith. I am not in despair because I know there is a moral order. I haven't lost faith because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I can still sing 'We Shall Overcome' because Carlyle was right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant was right. Truth pressed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell was right. Truth forever on the scaffold and wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." So of the people that he was quoting in that passage, William Cullen Bryant was a Unitarian, and so was James Russell Lowell, and along with Theodore Parker. And he makes reference to the song "We Shall Overcome," which Pete Seeger and others took an old hymn called "I Shall Overcome," and as you are wont to do, rewrote it and taught "We Shall Overcome" to Dr. King. But probably the Unitarian who had the biggest influence on King was Thoreau. In his autobiography, he writes, "When I went to Morehouse as a freshman in 1944, my concern for racial and economic justice was already substantial. During my student days, I read Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience for the first time. Here, in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay his taxes and his choice of a jailer rather than support a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Indeed, they are more alive than ever before. King was also influenced by Emerson. In his speech, Quest for Peace, in 1964, he wrote, Emerson said, "Who would be a man must be a nonconformist." And King continued to talk about nonconformity. The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists, those who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been nonconformists. In any cause that concerns the progress of humankind, put your faith in the nonconformists. Because of King's ability to bring 19th century Unitarian voices into the 20th century, it is fitting that we as Unitarian Universalists bring his words into the 21st century. Beacon Books is the publishing house of the Unitarian Universalist Association. In 2009, Beacon Press announced a new partnership with the estate of Martin Luther King Jr. for a new publishing program, The King Legacy. Beacon will print new editions of previously published King titles and compile his writings, sermons, orations, and prayers into entirely new editions. In January of 2011, Beacon released All Labor Has Dignity, containing unpublished speeches from the writings of King from 1954 to 67. These 50-year-old words resonate with the recent Occupy Wall Street movement. King speaks of Americans going to hell if they ignore the poor. Michael Honey, the editor of the book, talked about his favorite labor speech that King gave. The one I like the best, I guess, is the one the book is named for. All labor has dignity. A speech to the Memphis sanitation workers. It's not a scripted speech. It's marked by constant cheers and uproarious approval and chanting. He's talking straight from the heart. It's King at his best. He talks about the problems of two Americas, one poor, one rich. The gulf between people with inordinate, superfluous wealth and the people suffering in an abject, deadening poverty. He talks about the working poor, people whose work he calls full-time jobs with part-time wages. He talks about hospital workers being as important as the physician, and sanitation workers being as important as the doctor. How labor is not menial until you're not getting adequate wages. All jobs are important. The question is, do you have dignity and respect and a decent livelihood based on what you do? Honey says, I think it's a marvelous speech. It deals with a lot of the issues that we are still dealing with today. "50 years ago, King said in a speech, Social Justice and the Emerging New Age, he talked about being maladjusted. There are certain things in our nation and in the world which I am proud to be maladjusted, and which I hope all men of goodwill will be maladjusted until the good societies realize. I say very honestly that I never intend to become adjusted to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that would take necessities from many to give luxuries to the few. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism, to self-defeating effects of physical violence. But in a day when Sputniks and explorers are dashing through outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. It's no longer the choice between violence and nonviolence. It's either nonviolence or non-existent. I call on all of us here today to be maladjusted. Perhaps when you told your friends and family that you were Unitarian Universalist, they called you maladjusted. Or worse. When you advocate for equal marriage rights, you will be called maladjusted. When you call for religious freedom, you will be called maladjusted. When we call for women's reproductive rights, we are called maladjusted sexual deviants. Usually they have shorter words that they use for women. When we say live in harmony with nature, a consumer society says we are maladjusted. When one decries the worship of violence and the idolatry of the gun, so-called patriots will call one maladjusted to the realities of a dog-eat-dog world. Let us not conform to the dysfunction of this world. Let us ever strive to build a better society for ourselves, for our children, for the children of strangers, and yes, even the children of our enemies. May King be a reminder of our Unitarian Universalist heritage. May you remind us of what is best in Christianity. And know that he saw the power of love as something universal that transcended all religions. I conclude with these words from his 1967 speech against the Vietnam War. And when I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of John. Let us love one another, for God is love. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. This day and every day, may we be inspired by Dr. King to have the strength to love.